Hello, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural Halcyon podcast. Good morning, evening, or night, wherever you happen to be. We're going to cover some great things here about what's happening in the world of ransomware. We're going to look at some of the most recent ransomware attacks, some of the impact, some of the trends that are happening, tools, techniques and procedures that these attackers are using. We've got some things happening with law enforcement and big takedowns. Lots of things happening this week. My guests are Halcyon CMO Ryan Golden.
Happy to be here.
Good to have you. And a new addition to the team, we have our advisory CISO, Ben Carr. Ben, welcome to the Halcyon family.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Great to be here.
It's great to kick off the show with you. Ben, you are our SME. You are the boots on the ground, and you've been in the field for a number of years. Tell us a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, too many years to count now. It gets longer and longer every day. But I spent some significant time at Nokia, Visa, running a large part of that program. Was the CISO for a company called Aristocrat, global CISO for Qualys. Everybody should know. And then most recently was a CISO for a company called Cradlepoint, and now happy to be helping Halcyon out on the journey. So.
Excellent. It's great to have you. Well, we've got a lot to cover in this first show. We're taking kind of a broad swath. First, let's kind of level set here. How big is this ransomware problem? Okay, so 2019, ransomware really started to pick up. Through 2021, we saw attacks accelerating. We saw ransom demands going up. We saw the level of concern start to rise with organizations. 2022, there was kind of a mysterious dip, which we can discuss a little bit. But then 2023 broke almost all records. Where do we want to start with that? Golden.
I think the biggest thing that we kind of agree with, and kind of a shout out to Chainalysis for doing their report and rundown on tracking Bitcoin wallets and other crypto wallets associated with these ransomware actors. I think the big headline was really around like the amount of ransoms that were actually paid out. I think you can make an argument on the volume of attacks or overall number of attacks. Over the past couple of years, maybe 2021 might have been a higher volume potentially, but what we're seeing, and we kind of agree with them wholeheartedly, is that the actual amount of the payments in 2023 were all-time record-breaking
stuff. Yeah, they said
right?
It
$1 billion.
exceeded $1 billion.
Yeah, that's insane, right? That's a huge amount of just dark money entering economies that are barely tracked. So that's I think that was the big takeaway.
Yeah, Chainalysis, excellent report. If you haven't found it yet, we'll have the link in the notes. But does that really tell us how big the problem is? Because I recall the FBI putting out some information, Ben, not too long ago. They were in the Hive network for about 7 months observing their operations, and they estimated from that, Director Ray said, only about 20% of the victims were reporting that they'd been compromised and extorted by Hive.
Yeah, that's not really surprising, right? I mean, we see a lot of companies who don't report. In the CISO community, when I talk to other people who are, my colleagues, my compatriots, what we hear a lot about is that they're experiencing incidents. Things are happening, but they don't, they haven't had to report them until now. I think that's changed with some of the SEC changes in the guidelines that have come out. And I think that's why the SEC is making changes on that. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're an investor and there is a serious impact to the company, you want to know about it. So I think we're going to see these numbers go up because the mandatoriness of the reporting is going to be something that companies are going to have to deal with. And I think this figure is really low. I mean, we say it's exceeded $1 billion. If you were a startup, you'd love to have a revenue of $1 billion, right? But it's not on the decline at all. And I think just the reporting, as you point out, it's something that we're going to see that number go higher.
Now, do you think our inability to really put a finger on how big this problem is, does that affect how security teams are reacting to it? How much organizations are willing to invest?
I think it's a problem with the funding, certainly, right? So when I look at a company trying to fund a security program, one of the challenges we have as a CISO is trying to figure out, how do we articulate the problem and not create a bunch of FUD around it, but how do we actually say what the real scope is and what's the impact and potential risk to an organization? But with an underreporting factor, then we have to look at how do we compare that? How do we actually give the board an honest perspective of what the investment should be? And so that's where I think one of the big disservices is in the industry is that we're actually not putting the appropriate dollars. I think we were all hoping for a little more out of the SEC guidelines that came out, but I think it's at least a start where we'll see after some of the reporting comes out and the mandatory disclosures, hopefully people will see the scope of the problem is actually a lot larger than they think, and we might see the investment happening. And as a result, security teams might get funded to a better percentage.
It's interesting that the history of the security industry and security industry marketing in particular has always been the sky is falling. You have nation state actors in your network that's exfiltrating data, even though that may have not been the case, right? But now there's such a real impact that ransomware can have on a business where you're shutting down business operations, you're preventing them from making the thing that they make or transferring money or whatever the actual operation of the business is. Do you think that maybe after years of being burned out on worrying that the sky is falling with every possible avenue in cybersecurity, that this real challenge and this real issue of ransomware almost is deprioritized because it comes across as just another thing to be worried about?
Oh, I think it's come across. I mentioned FUD, I think previously, right? Like it comes across as FUD. Like that's been the problem for everybody is it's always the sky is falling. And so, in that situation where you're faced with this constant issue of like you implement some type of security solution, it costs the company a large amount of revenue to do that. The question is, are we investing wisely? And so from a board and an executive director position, when you get involved in that discussion, you come back to the table and you say, okay, now I need to implement this next solution. Yeah, but we just spent all this money, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think if we actually can see that there is a real problem and if there is a real solution to address it, I think there'll be a high uptake. But I think the problem till now has just always been it's the boogeyman, right? And so we're always fighting this unknown. And I think security professionals as a whole, we recognize that there is a real problem. But again, just contextualizing what the real scope is has made it a really hard problem for us to solve in an organization.
Okay, great. So we don't really understand the scope, but we do understand, a lot of things about the nature of this problem, right? These are well-organized operations, top down.
A business.
Yeah. Halcyon has talked about it.
Yeah.
It's comparable to a SaaS organization, right? In a disruptive market. So how are these ransomware attackers so well organized, so well funded, going after this? What we just had last week, the Lockbit takedown, right?
Yeah.
The most prolific actor. What are they estimated? About 25% of the attacks out there were originating with the Lockbit platform or Lockbit
and I think
affiliates.
It was like a fourfold increase over the previous year, right? So, I mean, you ask why this is such a big thing, and I think we had it up on the screen, the last shot was $1 billion of revenue, right? Mm-hmm. If you think about that as a business again, and you think about Lockbit as a startup, as Clop as a startup, like any of these companies, we have to treat them as companies and think about the profit motivations that are there. So a lot of the other issues we face in security, they're problems, but they're not a revenue generating business, right? There may be some profit margin behind it or maybe some criminal activity, but not to this level. And so as this pivot has happened, I think we've seen a lot of organizations get involved in this for those reasons, for a profit center. And so as a result, we're seeing people treat it like such, right? Ransomware as a service, having affiliate programs. I mean, they are really running this in a way that if you were thinking about your business, you should be thinking about the threat actors doing the exact same thing. And so the motivation is there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I think that, the affiliate network and sort of the only the tip of the iceberg with these actors is underappreciated. I think it recently came out that Lockbit had registered something like 200 different affiliates. Yeah. Those are people that can amplify your attacks, that are using their platform to carry these things out. That's a lot of other folks carrying out these deeds, right? That's a partner program.
It really is.
I think that's more partners than we at Halcyon currently have in our partner program, right? So the ability to just amplify with these affiliates because of the simple reason that it makes money is huge, right? There's a huge network effect.
So let's to put that in a little context, let's look at some of these numbers from SANS that Lockbit. 393 documented cases in 2022, over 1,000 in 2023. Mm-hmm.
And those are just confirmed.
Those are just confirmed, reported ones. Yeah. Right. AlphaV, about 250 cases in 2022. Not quite a 100% increase to about 422 in 2023. right? And so on and so on through. I think there's some numbers here for Clop that do not include their exploitation of the Go Anywhere and Move It, which I believe there's some estimations of over 1,000 companies were compromised just in the Move It campaign alone. How well they were able to monetize that remains to be seen. But these are big numbers.
I think the payouts doubled, right? Like the average payout, I believe, doubled for 22 to 23. So, I mean, when you if you get back at what the motivation is for this, it's value, right? It's money, it's profit.
Yep.
Yeah. So, is there an aha moment there for organizations and being able to really confront this threat straight on?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by an aha moment. If you mean an aha moment that, yes, this is a real problem, I think most people who are running a good security program understand that, yes, ransomware is something I'm scared of, right? Ransomware is something that they fear. I think if you look at the two target areas that I think I've seen, in my mind at least, have been most prolifically attacked, it's been healthcare and it's been SLED, state, local, education, government, right? Like that's what we see. And why do you see that? I think because there's a lower investment in those two areas, typically in the government side and in the healthcare side. Also in the healthcare, there's a lot of legacy systems, legacy environments. And so it's harder necessarily to protect. If you're a tier one, like a large financial, right, large technology firm, they're putting money behind it. They see that, right? But I also think it's combined with the challenge of not really understanding how do I hit this threat head on? What do I use? And I think a lot of companies have used typical solutions when that really actually doesn't solve the problem, right? Because the way ransomware actually attacks a system is just different. It's not the same. And so many of the solutions that people have deployed now, things are still getting by them, right?
Yeah. So an EDR solution that's trained on millions of samples of malware, some of which a subset are ransomware, right?
And it's not to say that doesn't, those solutions aren't good and they don't stop things. They do, right? But every ransomware attack we see that's actually successful is getting by some other security technology. And a lot of times that includes an advanced EDR package, right? And so why are we seeing that? Because the way that is actually attacking, compromising the system is just not in the scope of what the EDR is trained to see and trained to look at. And so I think, again, it gets back to that frustration of I've got to look at other solutions. I can keep continually making this investment. So, I'm really hoping that the visibility here helps articulate that it is a real issue that we need to look at and solve. It's a real problem for organizations, and there are solutions out there that, like Halcyon, that are actually targeted to address that. And I think once people start putting that together, I think we'll see a lot more traction here.
Okay. Let's spin off a little bit here and talk a little bit more about the attackers, TTPs. Very strange, I think, to see cyber criminals, assuming they are, burn in 0 days. Isn't that something you'd normally see a nation state say for an espionage operation? Aren't those fairly valuable?
Yeah, well, I think several years ago, Rob Joyce, who was the head of tailored access operations for NSA, he made a comment that, they don't burn 0 days, right? Meaning, 3-letter agencies aren't burning 0 days because they don't need to, because there's a ton of stuff that's out there, active vulnerabilities that they can take advantage of without having to burn those 0 days. And so what you'll see is those organizations, and I think really advanced threat actors, nation states, they're not having to do that because they can get into a system and they're looking for a long dwell time, and they're going to take advantage of that when they actually need to, right? Again, what's the motivation here? I think the motivation's financial, right? And so it doesn't really matter if they're burning a 0 day, if they're using that, because their goal isn't long-term persistence and dwell. Their goal is to generate a profit and a return on an investment. So if they can do that, they will. And so that's why I think we're seeing that. I mean,
it's entirely opportunistic.
Yeah.
Right. And with the sort of large amount of these groups that are out there, if one doesn't use it, it's competitive advantage. Like they're all going to use it once it becomes known to the world that there's a vulnerability in this piece of software. It's widely adopted. Of course, you're going to have automated scanners
Again,
that go
from a
and
business
look
side,
for it.
it's first mover advantage, right?
To.
It's first mover advantage. I want to be the first guy there to use that and get the most revenue I can out of that. And I don't care about the next guy.
Exactly. Of course. You don't want to be the blockbuster in the world of Netflix when it comes to being a RAS actor, right?
Right. Okay. Well, that brings up a good point because it's only been a few O days that we've seen documented that ransomware groups have used. But they're exploiting known vulnerabilities right and left. I mean, there's huge campaigns that went on First, early last year, Clop was exploiting a vulnerability in Go Anywhere, which is a file sharing program, and then similarly did it to a even grander scale against Move It. Yeah. Also, a lot of targeting. So we're seeing more Linux versions coming up, specifically like Linux versions targeting VMware VSXi. These are patchable things, right?
Yeah. And your point?
Well, I know. I understand that patching is hard, right? It's not as easy. People is just, it's not like your home computer where you say, yeah, update.
Yeah. That's my bread and butter. That's my background, right? Was attack surface management, vulnerability management, obviously, time at Qualys and other companies. Patching isn't hard, right? The problem is, I think, one, it's not sexy, right? Patching, vulnerability management, addressing stuff. Patching traditionally is an IT task. It's not a security task, right? The control of doing vulnerability management, that's a security task. But actually patching is something on the IT side that just hasn't been done very well, right? And I think a low priority to it. So yes, I think everyone would recognize if you get out and you patch your systems, you have a much lower likelihood. But the problem is the scope, right? It's the large number that are out there. And if you actually compare the number of vulnerabilities that are actually utilized and compromised versus the number of vulnerabilities out there, you'll find it's actually a very small amount, right? And they tend to cycle, right? So you'll see once an actor uses something, there'll be a big upswing, and then people start to patch and it'll go down again. And they'll just move from vulnerability to vulnerability. I think the challenge around that is really implementing a program that you can do repeatably. And again, it's not sexy, and things that aren't sexy in security, people tend not to chase them. But it's the hygiene problem that we've always faced. And if you address the hygiene problem, you get after a lot of this. You'll still have the 0 days. You'll still have things out there, right? I think the benefit somewhat to 0 days is not everybody knows about them. If you know about a vulnerability, I mean, yes, you should certainly patch it. But I think part of it is the prioritization issue, trying to figure out what is actually the biggest bang for the buck in an organization to actually fix first and how to burn down that vulnerability pile.
Well, I don't have this stat right in front of me, but I recall one that the majority of these vulnerabilities that are being exploited by ransomware operators are more than 5 years old.
Yeah.
So there's been a patch out there for a long time.
Like
been a patch out there so long, the version of the software is probably not.
And I think it gets to why is Windows the most compromised platform, right? It's because it has the most prevalence out there, right? The largest known stack of public vulnerabilities that are available, right? And so when you have that scope and the availability and the easy access to it, that's going to lead you down the path of the first and available target. Again, as a business, and this is one of the ways I think companies can learn to protect themselves, is a business is going to take the least difficult path to profit, right? And so if you think about addressing that in when you're looking at threats, fix the things that you can, make your attack surface as small as possible, do those things that make it someone else the more attractive and easier to go after target, and you reduce your surface greatly.
So again, Clop, 2 big campaigns last year. The Move It IT won. Thousands of organizations compromised in a matter of weeks. That's a lot of fingers on keyboards, or are we seeing some automation here?
Yeah, I think automation is on the tip of everyone's tongue, whether you're a business or one of these RAS groups, right? The ability to cut down the time that it takes to either do reconnaissance or deploy or do enumeration and lateralization is huge. So I think these attackers, they don't have to go through things like SOC compliance before they roll the tool out in their organization. And so we've definitely seen a move towards a lot of improvement of just speed with any of these groups. I know that there's been in sort of the conversations that I've had about seeing going from nothing to full compromise and full encryption in 8 hours. 10 hours less. These attackers are moving faster, and it's not because they're putting more hands on keyboards. Some of them are. Some of these groups can be, fairly sizable. But the reality is they kind of have everything available to them, right? From automation of tooling to doing their initial sort of campaign planning, it's there. There's a software product that can help them, or they can build it right?
So this makes me curious then, and back to one of our earlier points of why there was a lull in 2022 in the volume of attacks. How much overlap are we seeing between nation state operators, cyber criminal operations, the players? Maybe they're working for the SFB during the day and they're doing a little ransomware at night, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm. I think that's all speculation at the end of the day, because attribution, I think we all know is a bit of a fool's errand.
Well, where do you draw the line too, right? The guy who's the criminal actor may be also a nation state actor during the day, right? Like,
sure.
I think the line isn't as important as the result that we're seeing from the activity. And you referenced it in the prior point about why we're seeing more of these things. I think it's the adoption of AI. It's the adoption of automation. In the security industry, we're continuously looking, how do we automate? How do we take people out of the picture, put them on more human needed tasks, things that are a higher order problem to solve? But those repetitive automation things are happening. And we talked about the rise in the affiliate numbers. Like, it's just all a numbers game, right? Mm-hmm. And so the more you can throw things at it to automate and create affiliates to then drive those numbers even up higher, that's why we're seeing the rise, right? Mm-hmm. That's what I think is really happening.
I think your point about that dip in 22 was the interruption of certain networks in former Soviet bloc countries and in Ukraine with the invasion by Russia. Was that resources being diverted? Not sure. Was that a split, as we saw with the Conti groups, where there was a divide within Conti? I think those leaks are very public and everyone's looked at them. Where one team disagreed with another team's take on the Ukraine-Russia situation, and so I think a lot of that was kind of like a vacuum and potentially just chaos with those teams in general. They're back at it, right? 2023 is right back to
with the passion.
Yeah, with the passion, I would say, with the increased vengeance. I think we've seen a lot of power vacuums form when one group disbands, but they pop right back up. And I know we talked a little bit about Lockbit, and with that group and the impact of this like multinational takedown, including a couple of, I think it was 2 arrests potentially, one in Ukraine, one in Poland. I think it's safe to say that if anybody thinks that's the end of these actors, it's not. Like, there will be other splinter groups and pop-ups, and they will move on and rebrand. We've already seen multiple groups rebrand after becoming maybe a little bit too public for their own liking. So it's definitely not the end.
Sure. I mean, rebranding, retooling, same operators.
Well, with any criminal organization, right? I mean, we've all watched enough movies with the mafia and crime families to see that, like, when something happens, it's just a pivot and a shift, right?
It's an opportunity.
And a different group rises up and they change the model slightly and go off and continue doing business, right? Look, at the end of the day, this comes down less to the organizations and how they work than our response to it, and the inability to say we're not going to do ransomware payments. Right. I mean, that's kind of the elephant in the room. Is it just exists out there. People decide whether they want to pay. And it's a hard decision for a business. Right. Mm-hmm. One, you're thinking, like, is my business going to be down? Okay, what's the cost? Right. And I evaluate that as a risk. In some cases, in a healthcare environment, it may be, a risk to life. So those are really hard choices to make. And there's a short-term impact from making that decision. But the long-term benefit is, if we actually get behind it and don't make ransomware payments and make that potentially illegal, there's a long-term payoff, right? But until we get to that point, I think we're always going to be circling around just a new way to execute this business model and to take advantage of companies who are going to be forced to pay ransom.
No, I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So if we banned ransomware payments, we still have attackers getting in there, exfiltrating data, extorting companies.
Yeah, I'm not saying we're going to eliminate the criminal threat, or I'm not saying that the security risk is going to go away. That will still be there, right? But if we take away the financial benefit of creating ransomware, right, if that goes away, then I think the resultant activity trends way down, right? Because what's the benefit of developing a new ransomware campaign and going after and doing it if nobody can pay you? Like, there's not a benefit, right? So do those people pivot to other things? Potentially, possibly, right?
Because we have seen a few of these groups abandon the ransomware payload altogether, like Beyond Leon.
Yeah. So I that for me is where I think we get a handhold on this. Again, security teams are still going to have jobs. We're all still going to be employed, and there's still going to be problems. There's still going to be nation state threats. There's still going to be just people who have nothing better to do than cause malicious activity, right? So those things still exist. But the ransomware problem in itself is really well defined as, a profit center. And anytime you can remove that cost to the profit center, then people either have to find a functionally new way to generate profit or conduct business, or they're just unemployed. And so
we're at least taking away one revenue stream.
Yeah, right. And so that's why I think it's something we have to consider and look at. But to date, it's been really hard to get any movement on that.
Okay. So, Ryan, Colonial Pipeline, kind of a watershed moment, kind of what spurred the birth of Halcyon as well.
I think it was one of the first, I think, forays into like the really big real world impacts. For those that recall, it was May 21, I think it was that. And this wasn't some type of exotic Stuxnet spinning, de-enriching uranium or whatever. It was a pretty simple attack. And the reality was that it ended up impacting, I believe, their ability to just kind of move money around, right? In their ability to do accounting normally. And that quickly spiraled into declaring a state of emergency in a number of states in the Southeast, and impacted gasoline deliveries, right? That is something that's terrifying as an accident, right? I don't believe that was necessarily the intended impacts of that attack.
Totally, I think an accidental, unintended consequence, right? Like made it so much more likely for somebody to pay a ransom, but at the same time, like it really brought people to people's forefront of their minds what the potential impact is for critical infrastructure.
Well, that makes, I mean, they want to bring pain. Pain brings money for them.
Sometimes too much pain brings too much attention too, because I know that that group necessarily did not want to be in the spotlight that much, where there's emergencies from the White House being declared.
They were gone like 2 weeks later, weren't they?
For the most gone part. In quotes, right? Yeah. And into some of these other organizations, I'm sure. But it's pretty simple to have some really big catastrophic impacts. I know we'll talk about healthcare impacts a bit later in this show. But we're starting to see that spill over into the real world, and it's frightening.
Isn't that kind of like with any emerging market? So first, there's attempts for the market to self-regulate, right? So let's not attack schools and hospitals. A couple of the groups said, and when attempts at self-regulation don't work, then the state usually steps in and as a regulatory body, right? Which the state probably in this case being Russia saying, I don't like to see President Biden saying my name and our country's name alongside ransomware attacks and stuff like that.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I don't think it even went at that level. I think just the increased look at those groups by the FBI's task force for ransomware and every security vendor on the planet, you want to operate a consistent profit below the radar, I think, is the ultimate goal.
There's a safe margin, right? Yeah. Like you're making money, but you're not making too much money where it raises a bunch of eyebrows, right? Correct. And so I think that's where ransomware's been, right? I think you might agree. It's been something that we've all known's been going on. People pay a couple Bitcoin here, a couple Bitcoin there, but it hasn't raised to this level of a national threat. And I think Colonial Pipeline changed that, where it was so impactful from an infrastructure side to the economy, where people started to pivot. And I think that scared a lot of people, right? I would look at that in two ways. There's a good and the bad to that, right? There's a good of, yes, maybe it toned it down a little bit to kind of box it in some way. But the bad thing is, like, I do think it raised eyebrows and potential, although people became aware of it and said, yeah, infrastructure is potentially at high risk. I still don't think that we've done enough to address that. And it causes concern that there's a larger problem there, that we just haven't made the investment in an infrastructure security side to, critical infrastructure I'm talking about now. I still think that there's a big gap there.
Well,
right?
Not
necessarily a
broad,
ransomware problem, right? but a problem for us and for the industry and for security as a whole.
Isn't there like 16 different verticals designated as critical infrastructure? I mean, it's a pretty wide swath of.
Yeah, and I think how we address it isn't great, right? It's certainly there's an enhanced look at critical infrastructure. There's some reporting and concern over that, but it's it's not handled with the uniformity, I think, that we actually need to do to address the problem. Now, again, there's a ransomware component in that where I look at it and I say, yes, it calls out the fact that there's a large issue there. But just in general, from a critical infrastructure side, I mean, there is a security risk as a whole that I think, long-term, we need to take a look at, because certainly it made, I think, threat actors aware that that's a viable path for them to take if they really want to cause damage and harm.
Sure. Oh, one of those sectors is, of course, healthcare. Healthcare being one of the two, healthcare and education, for reasons we spoke about earlier, lack of resources and stuff, being two of the most attacked industry verticals, right? This is starting to get really serious with healthcare, right? I mean, we're starting to see some, potentially lives at risk, or even lives potentially lost based on statistics. Again, I'll be clear, I don't know that there's any specific attack where you can point to a person who has died from an attack, but I think there's plenty of research out there that shows that this is negatively impacting patient care. For example, we got a recent survey by Ponemon found that 68% of healthcare providers said that ransomware attacks disrupted patient care. 43% said that the exfiltration of personal health information was negatively impacting patient care. 46% noted increased mortality rates following ransomware attacks, and 38% noted that there were more complications in medical procedures. I mean, because if you can't access somebody's film, right, their images, their medical history, stuff like that, if medical systems are down, they're used in operating rooms and stuff. I mean, is this more impactful to the healthcare industry than we're even seeing from these stats, which are pretty alarming?
Yeah, right? I can't speak from experience as like any kind of a healthcare worker or anything, but I think it's very clear that it's a complex environment. They operate 24 hours a day. They have multiple shift changes. They have tons of legacy, very expensive hardware ran by very old computers, new systems. The sharing of records is pretty complex. They're heavily regulated. It's just a pretty big attack surface, and it is one of those things that has an immediate impact as well. If you have to divert ambulances, if you have to delay care or surgery because records couldn't be accessed appropriately, that's a huge pain point to try to elicit a ransom payment, from a victim. So the healthcare angle, I know you had mentioned earlier, there were certain groups that strayed away from it, but it sounds like now I don't think there's really that gentleman's agreement with most of the groups.
Yeah.
It seems like it's such a big target, and most of them are going after it. I think because the immediate pain leads to a fairly quick ransom payment if they decide to pay.
I think a lot of healthcare organizations feel like they don't have another choice, right? Mm-hmm. They have to bring it because it's patient care, and so it's really hard. If it's just patient records, it's one thing that can be concerning, but it's not as severe as patient care. But when it ends up being patient care impactful, that's certainly something I think it's really hard to make a decision that we didn't pay $1 million in a ransomware payment because we didn't want to make the payment. Instead, these two people lost their lives. I think to your point about tying it back, it's really hard, right? I think if you look at what's the impact? Did someone have a reduction or a delay in care that then resulted in death or some type of impact? Can you tie that directly back? And it's really hard to make that direct tie back. But there was a study out that I think the increase was with Medicare patients specifically. Yeah. It was a 33% increase in a monthly death rate, right, per 100 people, if there was a ransomware incident that happened at the time. Now, is that enough to show direct tie back? Again, still potentially hard, but if you can show that consistently time after time, then I think there starts to be an argument that is impactful, right? That is something that's actually impacting people's lives.
Yeah, one of the more authoritative studies on this one estimated that between 2016 and 2021, that ransomware attacks contributed to between 42 and 67 patient deaths. So that's
now, look, if we had an industrial facility that had a ransomware issue and something blew up and we saw 5 people die as a result of that, that's a lot easier to show the direct linkage. I think the linkage is still here. I think again, it's what's underreported. what's misunderstood, right? Unintended consequences and impact. There's a lot of variables that go into this, but I think the data is very clear that there is a definite impact to the healthcare system in the U.S. as a result of this.
Well, and intuitively, you can just assume that if a hospital system shut down and there's patients in there getting healthcare, that there's going to be some kind of impact, right? Yeah. So even if we don't have the hard numbers yet. Worth noting, during these ransomware attacks, since data exfiltration has become a really big deal, big part of these operations, that the PHI, the personal health information of over 70 million patients were compromised in 2023. Ryan, that's 70 million patients.
Yeah, I think I think that number came from the top 10 or top 11 attacks as well. So it most likely is much more than that. And that's a little bit different than sort of your basic PII, right? Medical records are incredibly private matters. Who knows what that information, what's that information is used for? Probably in similar fashion, we don't know the extent of the OPM breach data that was all the SF-86 forms and everything else associated with that. Healthcare patient records are pretty brutal of a thing to get leaked. I know that was one of the big components. I think of that 70 million, I don't believe that all stemmed from just ransomware attacks. I think that's kind of like cyber breaches, even if ransomware wasn't confirmed as a whole in 2023. But still, that's a lot of records, and that industry obviously is fairly heavily regulated as well, right? Much more so than certain other industries that don't have all that burden on them.
And we do have documentation of incidents where some of these ransomware groups have released, say, the very compromising photos of breast cancer patients, records of school children's psychiatric treatments, records of abuse, sexual assault. They release this information basically to compel the victim organization to pay up and stuff. So
yeah, and I think one of the things we're seeing, at least I know specific incidences, is where not only is that data being used as evidence to say, look, we actually have the data, pay up, but then the third parties are being extorted, right? So the people who actually own that data, the companies that potentially own that data, not just the company who had the data, they're being extorted for that, right? In addition, and that data is frequently even being leaked after the fact. So the question that often comes up in the boardroom is, do we pay the ransomware, right? Even if you pay it, that may not solve your problem. And certainly with the new guidelines from the SEC, it doesn't solve the reporting problem, right? You've still got to report on that as a potential material issue. So yeah, I think the privacy and the leakage of data is a much larger issue than people are really giving it credit for.
Okay, so I'm going to throw this one out there. When do ransomware attacks that threaten lives, ransomware attacks against healthcare providers, when does it or will it reach the threshold that they actually become terrorist attacks? And I'll couch that a little bit. If a gunman walked into a hospital and held the staff and patients for ransom, probably be talked about a little bit differently in the media than an IT downtime issue, which ransomware often is addressed as.
Yeah, so the challenge is, look, I'm a fan of some type of increased way to categorize this, right? When we think about it as terrorism, the challenge is terrorism as a defined term has political goals. And that's really the challenge in looking at this as a terrorist thing. It's very close, but even in your example of, guy walks in with a gun at a hospital, says, I want $1 million. That's much different than walking in and saying, I want these political prisoners to be released, right? That's terrorism. And so that's the challenge here is, I think your call out is 100% right. We need a different way to categorize this when it's large scale. It is a form of terror, right? It is a form of a fear tactic against a population or group of people. But labeling it as terrorism, I think, is where people start to break down and say, well, it doesn't fit the definition of the term. Maybe we need a new term, right? Maybe we need a new way to deal with this, because it's not just, someone holding up the convenience store. It's not someone, running a red light. This is, potentially impacting large amounts of the population or critical infrastructure, potentially causing serious harm, even death.
Yeah, some of the impacts include suspension of emergency services, canceled medical procedures, down billing systems, ambulances being diverted to, 40 minutes to another healthcare provider.
Which that impacts that facility as well. I think one of the issues is just the murky nature of the operators, right? I know we don't have it on here, but I believe it was Orange Cyber or Orange Defense had a lineage chart of nation state, the APT groups that had splintered off and had some kind of a maybe a tooling mark or two show up in some of these RAS group platforms. That attribution piece is, to some degree, I think what you'd need to label it as terrorism appropriately too. Like, what is the actual origination, from a group or a nation state? We don't really have that, right? It's such just a murky field of people.
That's why we've seen in the actors that I think there's a large belief in the industry that there are actors that are of a nation state category, right? That are actually either moonlighting or doing this as a part-time job, right? And doing it for profit, right? But the reason why you don't see necessarily nation states standing up against this and saying, yes, we're going to do this as a state-sponsored side is because then it enters into the area of the Department of Defense. Mm-hmm. And they know that that's a line that they don't want to cross. So doing it as a profit center is one thing. Doing it as an act of war is a different. But there's almost this gray area in between they're operating in that I think we need to classify differently somehow. We're not going to go to physical war with the country over this necessarily, but we have to figure out a way to put an end to the activity. We can either do that, or we can go back to the initial premise I brought up of we can limit the way people can actually pay ransomware or say you can't do it. Those are the two ways to attack it. You either have to stop the problem at the source or take away the motivation for it, right? And if we don't do one of those two, we're going to keep seeing this.
Yeah, I think my pushback on the whole remove the ability to pay a ransom is you'd have to add those groups who maybe a few of them, but not everybody involved. And you'd have to add them to some kind of to list it where it's a forbidden transaction to transact with that entity. Or
so I think you're right. Like there's an OFAC guidance out, right, that actually says there are a number of countries that you can't pay if it's related to that. But looking at attribution, again, to your point, is really, really hard. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying let's say you can't pay CLOP. I'm saying you just can't make a transfer payment of a ransomware, right? Like
so
ransom
then I stand
is
up a
illegal.
Subsidiary in Switzerland that magically facilitates a payment for a service is rendered. I think we all agree that it'll take 30 seconds to bypass those type of regulations, right?
But potentially, I think again it gets back to if there's no reporting requirements and there's no compliance around it, yes, it's super easy to do that, right? So did the SEC guidelines go far enough? No, I think a lot of people in the industry, especially CISOs I've talked to, we recognized that we wanted something more, we wanted something different, right? Now that wouldn't have solved the ransomware problem, but it gets to the larger point of, yes, you have to have laws and guidelines around it. There are always going to be these shadow ways to go around it. The problem right now is you could drive a bus through the way you can do it.
Yeah. So how many of these attacks, conveniently also serve geopolitical,
and that's where the ransom, that's where becoming terrorism, that's where it starts to broach. But it's really hard to make the connection.
Without being able to do attribution, you've got potentially these groups acting as proxies. Attribution will never be solved as an issue, at least for the private corporations, right, or private citizens, right. I think you also have to take into account how many ransomware campaigns are the arson after the bank robbery already is as a cover-up for an espionage activity, which could be maybe labeled as a nation-state act or in there for a reason, possibly for political terrorism purposes or just run-of-the-mill espionage. We don't really know, right? You get the headline of ransomware data exfil, yada, yada. What's not talked about a lot is how did that initial access happen? Was that maybe facilitated for a purpose or a reason? Right.
And one of the things we spend the most time doing is in an incident as a CISO, one of the things you're trying to figure out is what's the blast radius, what was compromised, what actually happened, right?
You don't care who did it.
We're trying to put it back together. We're trying to put the pieces, put Humpty Dumpty back on the wall again. But the problem is what was inside Humpty Dumpty? Yeah. What did people see? What did they potentially get access to? And that's that's super hard, especially in a 4-day reporting window. That's super hard to come up with, right? It's super hard to know. And oftentimes we just don't know. We make educated guesses, but we can't say with 100% certainty that this is the boundary of the blast radius and we know what happened. What we can say is, this is what we think. This is our best estimate, right? And that's what we report on and we can talk to the board about and regulatory guidance. But I think to your point, like, we need to figure out how to stop it on the front side, right? Get something in place where you don't have the exfiltration of data, you don't have the extortion, you don't have. So, like, I think that's what we're all striving for, is to figure out a way to get to that point.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, this has been a great conversation, gentlemen. A great way to kick off the show. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ryan, for your time. We will be putting out one of these shows once a month. We'll probably even look to ramp that up a little bit. We've also got another show that we're spinning up with Ben where we're going to put some CISOs in the hot seat and kind of get a little bit more in depth into some of the wonderful things that Ben insights that he was giving us here. Be sure to check out halcyon.ai, where you can find all kinds of new and interesting ransomware resources. You can check out our recent ransomware attacks map, where we got some live attacks going on, getting updated constantly. We've also got our quarterly Power Rankings Ransomware Malicious Quartile report that I write. And follow us on social and see more. Tune in again. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.